All right, everyone, welcome back. Today, the daily routine is interrupted when a dear friend of our Hannigan goes missing. Who or what took her? I hope you all enjoy finding out in the latest chapter of the Neverglades mysteries, The Wendigo. Everyone on the force knew Marconi had a girlfriend, and it wasn't a big deal. We sometimes saw her hanging around the station when Marconi was getting off her shift. She was a kind-faced woman, frizzy brown hair, thin where Marconi was stocky, always wearing something bright and flowery. Marconi didn't say much about her personal life, so we knew very little about this mystery visitor. I don't think we even knew her name. She was just another fixture around the station, like Larry the Drunk Wonder, who we brought into the holding cells every Friday like clockwork. But when she came to the front desk one misty morning, we almost didn't recognize her at first. She'd traded her floral blouse for a subdued gray shirt and jeans, and her frizzy hair was tied back in a tight bun. It didn't look like she was wearing any makeup. Abigail Shannon, our newest recruit, was working the desk that day, and she gave the visitor a dim smile. "Name?" she asked. "Janine," the woman answered. "Janine Zimmerman." She swallowed nervously. "I'd like to report a missing person." I was busy grabbing my third coffee of the morning, but when I heard the tremor in her voice, I turned to look at her. She didn't seem to know what to do with her hands. They plaited her hair, then fell to the counter, then drummed a rhythm on her thigh. Eventually, she settled for wringing them the way one might squeeze a wet dishcloth. Abigail pulled out the necessary forms and grabbed a pen from the top drawer. "Can you give me the name of the missing person?" she asked. A sense of dread crept over me, and I knew, even before she opened her mouth, what name she was about to say. I placed the coffee pot back on the counter before it could slip from my sweaty hands. Her voice faint, Janine said, "Olivia Marconi." I ducked into the men's room, lit up the inspector's card with my pocket lighter, and dropped the flaming piece of plastic into the sink. By the time the fire had died down and I'd returned to the main office, the inspector was already there. He and Nico Sanchez were ushering Janine into one of the interrogation rooms down the hall. I slipped in behind them before the door could close. Sanchez offered the flustered woman a chair and sat down across from her. The inspector and I remained standing. I noticed that his cigar was smaller than usual, closer to a cigarette, really, and the smoke issuing from it was thin and wispy. I wondered what had caused the change. "Why don't you walk us through what happened?" Sanchez said in his best good cop voice. "When did you notice the sheriff was missing?" Janine tugged at the sleeves of her shirt. She said, "Well, she didn't come home this weekend. We had dinner plans on Saturday, but she didn't show up and she didn't call to cancel. I thought she might have been on extended patrol or something, but I couldn't reach her cell phone to check in." I had noticed Marconi's absence, but had assumed the same thing as Janine. Some patrol or stakeout had kept her away from the station for a while. Even so, the fact that she hadn't gone home at any point was enough to set off warning bells. It wasn't like Marconi to go so long without keeping in touch. Hell, I could barely get through most mornings without her grilling my ass for one thing or another. "Do you know what case she was working on?" the inspector asked quietly. Janine looked unsure, so I answered for her. "Marconi was looking into the whole thing with those missing campers. Some local teenagers went hiking in the Catamount Forest 3 weeks ago and haven't been seen since. She's been combing the area looking for any trace of those kids." Both Sanchez and the inspector turned to look at me. I probably shouldn't have spoken, but Janine's anxiety was getting to me, and Marconi's safety seemed a lot more important than sticking to procedure. Janine bit her lip and nodded. "Yes, that sounds right," she said. "I think I remember something about that." The next step seemed obvious to me. Book it the hell out to Catamount Forest and scour the trees for Marconi and those missing campers. I was just about to grab Sanchez and organize the rescue mission when Janine spoke up again, and oh boy, was that the kicker that changed everything. "I know where Olivia went," she said faintly. "She was taken by the Wendigo." You could see the precise moment when Sanchez slipped over from sympathetic to skeptical. His brow curled up a bit, his mouth tucking into a frown. The guy had never had the greatest poker face. I looked to the inspector for help, but if the word Wendigo meant anything to him, he didn't show it. He only stood there and ground the tip of his cigar between his teeth. "It lives in the forest," Janine went on, oblivious to the room's sudden shift in mood. "It used to be human, but not anymore. It preys on lost travelers and brings them back to its lair to feed. I saw it once," she added, as if that settled the matter. Sanchez rose from his chair and gestured for us to talk outside. The officer shifted his belt and led us out into the hall. Through the two-way mirror, we could see Janine stare numbly into space, her hands still trembling. "The lady's nuts," Sanchez concluded. "Marconi's probably got no reception in those woods, that's why we haven't heard from her. Wendigo my ass." "So Janine is upset and making up stories to cope," I said. "That doesn't change the fact no one's seen the sheriff for days, Sanchez. If there's even the slightest shred of a chance Marconi is missing, we've got to act on that. You know how important the first 48 hours are." The officer looked disgruntled. I hear you, Hannigan, he said, but we can't just drop everything and go stomping through the woods looking for her. You don't have the men to spare for an operation that huge. Then I'll go with the inspector, I said. We'll canvass as much of the forest as we can. If things get gnarly, we'll get the hell out of there and call for backup. I glanced at my otherworldly partner, who hadn't said a word since we'd stepped outside. He nodded simply. Sanchez shrugged. Your choice, detective. Just keep an eye out for Bigfoot while you're out there. Then he was gone, and it was just me and the inspector standing outside the interrogation room. The tall figure looked paler than I'd ever seen him. His grayish skin had taken on the complexion of ash. This, Wendigo, I said under my breath. Is it real? The inspector pondered the question for a few seconds. No, he said. Not as Janine describes it, anyway. Something in those woods may be hunting down campers, but I doubt it was ever human. I ran a hand through my hair and sighed. More monsters. Great. This could be quite dangerous, Mark, the inspector said. We have no idea what kind of entities are out there. Are you sure you want to do this? Marconi needs me, I replied, and so does she. I gestured to the woman sitting alone behind the glass. Janine had stopped shaking, but she was still staring out at nothing, her hand lying limp on the table. As we watched, her fingers closed slightly, then relaxed, as if gripping an invisible hand, for however brief a moment. The inspector rode with me to the Catamount Visitor Center, which seemed as good a place to begin as any. Plenty of dirt trails wound away from the center, and the lost campers, as well as Marconi, would surely have started their hike from here. I pulled my cruiser into the sandy lot and killed the engine. The place was nearly deserted. Only a few other vehicles sat beneath the shadows of the treetops. The inspector and I headed for the center and pushed open the stained wooden door. A young couple huddled in the corner of the wall of travel brochures. Tourists in the glade, always a rare sight. And a grizzled man in the back was thumping the side of a vending machine which seems to have swallowed his dollar. The inspector and I headed to the information desk, where a gray-haired woman in enormous green-rimmed glasses sat reading a home improvement magazine. I cleared my throat. Excuse me, I said. I'm Detective Mark Hannigan, and this is Inspector, Smith, from the FBI. We were wondering if you happened to see a woman in a sheriff's uniform come through this area in the last couple of days. The gray-haired woman, presumably Sheila, given her name tag, set aside her magazine and squinted up at us. You mean Olivia? She said. Nice lady. I see her down at the grocer's sometimes. Her voice was high and sweet, like she'd ingested something syrupy. That's her, I said, glancing at the inspector. You're saying she was here recently? Oh, yeah, she said. Looking for those campers, you know. Poor things. She began to leaf through her magazine again as if that settled the conversation. Did she say where she was going? I asked, irritated. Sheila waved a hand towards the door. Said something about checking out Timberwolf Trail. I told her that's the one the campers took, you know. She flipped the page and peered up at us. You boys looking for them too? Something like that, I muttered. Thank you for your time. I gestured to the inspector that we were done here, and together we headed for the exit. But just as I was reaching for the doorknob, it twisted on its own, and the door flew open from the other side. Standing at the threshold was Janine. She had a camo backpack slung over her shoulder and a water bottle dangling on a strap from her wrist, but otherwise she could have come right from the police station. Oh, she said. I grabbed her arm and ushered her down the stairs, the inspector trailing behind us. The door to the visitor center swung shut with a low creak. When we were safely out of anyone's earshot, I let go of Janine's arm. I hadn't switched to bad cop mode in God knows how long, but I could feel that old side of me start to resurface. What the hell are you thinking? I hissed. 4 people have gone missing in these woods, and you were just going to wander in all by yourself. Did you even bring any sort of protection? Janine's eyes grew hard, and all of a sudden I saw the same steel in there that I'd seen so often in Marconi. For your information, she growled, I have a compass and a map of the area and the sharpest pocket knife I bet you've ever seen. Then she drew up her baggy shirt and I saw a pistol tucked in the holster at her waist. And I've got this bad boy, she said. Is that enough protection for you? I looked to the inspector, but he had a wry smile on his face and I knew I was on my own here. I rubbed my temple and began to pace under the porch light. We can't let you go in there alone, I said at last. Even with a gun, it's just too dangerous. You don't know what's out there. Of course I do, she said. It's a Wendigo. I told you back at the station. I wasn't sure why I was suddenly being so skeptical. Between the two of us, I'd probably seen more weird shit than she ever would in her entire lifetime. But I just couldn't bring myself to believe in Janine's mystery monster. And that's gonna take it down, is it? I said, gesturing to the gun. You're a Wendigo? No, she said. Of course not. This is for bears or mountain lions. The Wendigo has its own weakness. She swung the backpack around and unzipped the top pouch. Inside was the largest pile of flares I'd ever seen. It's like Frankenstein's monster, she explained. Can't stand the sight of fire. If it gets too close, I'll light it up. Or burn the forest down, more like, I muttered. Janine zipped up the bag and gave me a long, pensive look. I have to do this, she said. Olivia's counting on me. If someone you loved was in danger, Detective, what would you do? The sympathy card. Damn it. Because Janine very well knew that I'd go to the ends of the earth and further for my wife and children, I'd be a dirty, rotten hypocrite if I stopped her from doing the same. Fine, I said. I shook my head and sighed. So you're going Wendigo hunting. Doesn't mean you're going in there alone. The inspector and I are coming too. Janine looked between us, then shrugged. Couldn't hurt, I suppose. But you're going to need some supplies first. Sheila can stock you guys up before we go. How long are you expecting to be out here? The inspector asked. In the shade of the trees, I couldn't see his face at all, just a blank stretch of shadow with a speck of embers at the bottom. Janine shifted her backpack over her shoulder and looked somberly at him. As long as it takes, she replied. 10 minutes and a backpack full of hiking essentials later, the three of us finally started down Timberwolf Trail. It was a simple dirt path, littered with bumpy rocks and crunchy fallen leaves. Every so often we passed a streak of yellow paint on a rock or a nearby tree. Even without the trail markers, I had a real hard time imagining the campers losing their way, unless they were complete idiots and had wandered off to explore the woods on their own. A low, thin mist hovered over the landscape, and Janine's form looked a bit fuzzy as she stomped her way along the trail. She had taken the lead without a word, mainly because her long, impatient strides kept leaving me in the dust. I shifted the straps of my new backpack and tried to catch up with her. So this Wendigo, I said. You told us you saw it before. Where was that? Janine ducked under a stray branch. I was on a camping trip with my aunt and uncle, she said. I was young, maybe 12 or so. We were gathered around the campfire when we heard these enormous, crunching footsteps and saw a shadow the size of a house moving through the trees. My uncle grabbed a log from the fire and waved it at the shadow, warning it to get back. It stopped for a few seconds, like it was deciding what to do. Then it turned around and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't know what I'd seen, but then my uncle told me the legend of the Wendigo and how it stalked these woods for centuries. She looked at me earnestly. I believed him. After what I'd seen, how could I not? I glanced at the inspector, unconvinced, but he didn't seem to be listening. His head was turned to the trees and his eyes were hidden. He didn't duck under the low branches, but they avoided him all the same, somehow sliding past him without moving an inch. Looking at him for too long made me mildly dizzy, so I turned my eyes back to the trail. Eventually, the path tapered off and turned into a leafy clearing, with a warped picnic table and the charred remains of a makeshift fire pit. Janine led us to the table and took a seat, rummaging through her backpack. She pulled out a plastic baggie with trail mix and offered it to me. I took a tiny handful of nuts and raisins, popped them into my mouth, and handed the bag back to her. We passed the bag back and forth until half of it was gone. The inspector politely declined when I offered some to him. He seemed distracted. The thin smoke from his cigar drifted into the nearby trees as if searching for something. We should keep moving, Janine said after a minute or two. She stowed the bag away amid her stack of flares and rose from the table. I wasn't nearly as spry as I used to be, and a few more minutes of rest would have done me good, but Janine was antsy, and she had every right to be. The campers must have spent the night in this clearing, I said, looking around, but they had time to pack up their stuff and keep moving. Whatever happened to them didn't happen here. Janine nodded. We have to go deeper. I turned to call the inspector and nearly jumped out of my skin. He'd somehow approached us without crinkling the leaves under his feet. Maybe it was my imagination, but even his clothes seemed more battered than usual. There were scuffs on his fedora and smudges of something dirty on his trench coat. He said nothing, only tilted his head at the disappearing Janine. I hastily followed her back onto the trail. The mist had thickened while we were resting, and the branches ahead poked like crooked arms out of the gray. Janine's outline, only a few yards away, was barely more than a smudge. I scrambled across the leafy, muddy rocks until I caught up with her. The inspector glided along behind us, his shadow as thin as the trees. How'd you meet Marconi, anyway? I asked Janine, brushing aside a low-hanging branch. My nephew's a Boy Scout, she replied. He'd gotten his Eagle rank and the troop was hosting a court of honor to celebrate. Olivia had helped him with his project, so she came to the ceremony to give a short speech about him. We met at the dinner party afterwards. She was the first woman who'd ever shown interest in me. She looked down at the ground and smiled. I liked her. She can be blunt, you must know what she's like, working with her and all, but she's kind and honest, and she has a good heart. We went on a few coffee and dinner dates before making things official. I tried to imagine Marconi cozying up in a coffee shop or getting dressed for dinner on the town. It was surprisingly hard. I knew she must have a life outside the precinct. that she didn't always wear uniform blue or tie her hair back in the tightest of ponytails. She had people who loved her, who saw more than just the badge. But I'd known her for so long that my image of her had just stuck. To me, she'd always be my pain-in-the-ass sheriff. "You're married, right?" Janine said. "How did you two meet?" I shrugged. "High school sweethearts. I know, it's straight out of a sitcom, but that's how it happened. We had a lot of the same classes together, and eventually we just got talking. It always felt easy with Ruth. I never felt like I was posturing or trying to make myself look good for her. It was just me, and she appreciated that." My shoes squelched in the mud. We went to separate colleges, but eventually we found our way back to the Glade. Everyone does, you know how it is. And we just picked up where we left off. 2 years later, we were married. Janine's hand drifted away from the strap of her backpack. Her fingers curled inward like they had at the station, as if clutching for a hand that was no longer there. Then she lowered her arm. "I was going to propose," she said quietly, "at dinner this weekend, and when she didn't show up, I thought she knew somehow, that I'd scared her away. I couldn't sleep at all that night, and then she wasn't there the next morning, and she never called to say why. I knew that something else had happened. Something had gone horribly wrong." Her voice hitched. "I don't even care about the proposal anymore. I just want to know she's safe." I reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked over at me, her green eyes sad and empty. "We'll find her," I said. "You have my word." Janine tried to smile. Her cheeks creased, then slackened. She looked down at the ground again. Then she quickened her pace, trotting through the muck until she was back to being a vague shadow on the trail ahead. It took another 20 minutes for us to find the first real sign of a disturbance. I had just rounded a particularly tight corner on the mountain trail when the mists parted and I saw Janine standing in front of a charred, blackened tree. The trunk had been cleaved straight down the middle, causing both halves to droop to either side and leaving a small opening in the center. Sap bled from a series of long, deep gashes in the bark. Well, what was left of it anyway. "Was it struck by lightning?" I asked, catching my breath. "I don't understand," Janine said. "The Wendigo hates fire. Why would it burn a tree like this?" "Because it's not a Wendigo," the inspector said from behind us. He strode forward and ran a thin finger along the trail of dying sap. I thought for sure he was going to taste the stuff, but he simply rubbed his fingers together, leaving sticky strands between them. "I've seen this before," he muttered. "A long, long time ago. Long enough that I thought they'd gone extinct." "They?" I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. "A tribe of empathic giants," the inspector said. "Brutes, most of them, but they figured out how to tear open the rift long before any of us. Their way is messy, destructive. They leave scars whenever they cross between worlds. Scorch marks, poisoned rivers, acid rain. That made it easier for me to track them down." Janine was staring at the inspector in baffled silence, and hell, I didn't blame her. We'd officially taken a left turn into Crazy Town. Wendigos were one thing. This was something else. I backpedaled a bit and tried to parse through what the inspector had just said. "Empathic giants," I repeated. "What does that mean exactly? What are we going up against?" The inspector knelt by the tree and ran a hand along the blackened wood. "They feed on emotions," he said. "The Time Eater we faced swallowed up years, but these creatures, they swallow happiness, fear, depression, hope. Each has a particular taste, and it feeds slowly, keeping its victims in stasis until it can suck them dry. And then it excretes this sap." He held up his sticky fingers, "and moves on to the next world, the next food source." Something else about the inspector's story had unsettled me, but before I could pin down what it was exactly, Janine found her voice. "This thing feeds slowly," she asked. "So there's still a chance that Olivia might be alive?" I stared at her. The first time I'd heard the inspector spout his alien gibberish, I'd resisted it, and who wouldn't? There just wasn't room in my worldview for beings from outside time and space. It had taken cold hard evidence for me to erase that doubt, but there was no doubt in Janine's eyes. And I knew, just as she had believed in the Wendigo, that Janine believed the inspector too. She'd believe any narrative that got Marconi home again. "There's always a chance," the inspector said cautiously. He rose back to his full 7 feet. "Keep in mind, though, that by all rights this beast should be dead. It's been lurking here longer than you can possibly fathom, which means it must be hungry, and hungry beasts aren't known to play with their food." Janine yanked the pistol out of the holster and pointed the gun past the charred tree into the heart of the mist. "A chance is a chance," she said quietly. "That's enough for me." Then she leaped nimbly over the crack in the wood and hurried into the fog. I shared a glance with the inspector. Longer than you can possibly fathom? I whispered. How fucking old are you, man? The inspector's eyes were hidden, but the face beneath his fedora looked grim. Old enough to know what kind of danger we're walking into, he said. But let's hurry. We can't let Janine get too far ahead. There was so much more I wanted to ask him, but he had a point. We'd have time to talk later, hopefully. I drew my own pistol, and together we climbed over the splintered remains of the tree and into the underbrush. I hope you've all enjoyed the first part of the fourth Neverglades mystery, the Wendigo. As always, I'll include links to the original post, the music, and the background in the description down below. I'll see you in a few days. Goodbye.